Steel clashed in the misty forests beyond Rome's reach, but in the heart of the enemy camp, a lone Roman stood, learning their ways, speaking their tongue, and mastering the art of war from those he was sworn to destroy. This is his untold story. The first breath beyond the frontier was colder than any Roman winter. Frost clung to the pine branches, the air heavy with the musk of damp earth and wood smoke. Behind him lay the ordered marble and stone of the empire. Ahead, the lawless expanse Rome called Barbaricum. He was no fresh recruit, no nameless scout sent to vanish in enemy lands. He was a general, a man who had commanded legions, spoken in the Senate, and worn the crimson-edged paludamentum of Rome's elite. And yet here he stood, alone, walking willingly into the domain of those the empire deemed uncivilized. It was not honor that brought him, it was necessity. The northern frontier was bleeding men to a foe who did not fight like any Rome had faced before. Cohorts broke against them, iron discipline shattered by ambush and feral speed. Rome's tactics, the same that had crushed Carthage and tamed Gaul, were failing. To understand this enemy, he would have to live among them, train as they trained, think as they thought. The moment he crossed the tree line, every step was measured. Eyes watched him from the shadows. Hunters with bows of ashwood, warriors with spears tipped in iron, and elders who had seen too many winters to trust a Roman smile. These were the Chatti, a Germanic tribe whose warriors moved like wolves and struck with the precision of a spear thrust to the heart. In Rome, the general had walked among polished armor and marble columns. Here, tribes, he was not a guest. He was a puzzle, perhaps a threat. In their longhouses, firelight danced on fur-lined cloaks and shields, painted with symbols older than the empire. Their leaders spoke in low, guttural tones, words he barely understood, but would soon have to master. Rome would never forgive a general who bent knee to learn from the so-called savages. But if the price of victory was his reputation, he would pay it. The empire demanded results, not explanations. And so, in the heart of the wolf's den, he began the most dangerous campaign of his life. Not against an enemy line, but against the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. The lessons would begin at dawn. The first lesson came without warning. A spear thrust aimed at his ribs before the frost had melted from the grass. Among the tribes, training was not ceremony. It was survival, sharpened to a killing edge. Every drill, every blow, was meant to break weakness and harden the body into a weapon. Roman training yards were squares of order, ranks in formation, commands barked in Latin, shields locking like clockwork. Here, the field was uneven, the ground churned to mud, and the only command was instinct. The Chatti warriors fought bareheaded, hair matted with sweat and soil, their strikes unpredictable, flowing from sudden bursts of speed to brutal grapples in the dirt. A legionary's rigid guard would shatter under the chaos of it. He learned to strike from concealment, to melt into the tree line, to listen for the subtle shift in wind that carried the scent of an approaching enemy. Night exercises demanded absolute silence, not the parade ground hush of Rome, but the kind where the wrong step meant a spear in the back. They moved in packs, spreading wide, cutting off retreat, forcing enemies into traps, where panic did the killing before steel touched flesh. Meals were as much a part of training as battle. Around the fires, the warriors chewed smoked venison and coarse bread, the smoke curling into the night sky, while war cries split the darkness. Deep, guttural roars designed to unnerve before a single weapon was drawn. Oaths were sworn in that firelight, palms cut and blood mingled, binding men to one another with a loyalty forged in shared hardship. In Rome, discipline was drilled through repetition, through the weight of armor, the burn of the march. Among the barbarians, discipline came from the raw certainty that only the strongest walked away. Their shields were lighter, their weapons often cruder, but their movements were alive, unshackled by formation. They did not fight to hold ground, they fought to destroy the will of the enemy. By enduring their trials, the general absorbed their rhythm. He learned when to abandon rigidity for sudden violence, when to bait the enemy into a blind charge, when to disappear entirely until the moment to strike arrived. The transformation was not just in skill, but in thought. And when he returned to Rome, it would be with tactics the legions had never seen, and with a knowledge the Senate might one day call treason. Next would come the test of whether Rome itself could accept what he had become. Trust was not given. It was earned in sweat, blood, and the unspoken pact of survival. Among the tribes, alliances were not signed on parchment, but hammered into shape through shared hardship. Day after day, the general trained, hunted, and bled beside the very men Rome had called its mortal enemies. Battle drills became the forge of unexpected bonds. In the ring of shields, they slammed against one another until muscles burned and breath came in ragged gasps. In the stillness of the hunt, they tracked game through the dense undergrowth, each man relying on the other's skill to eat that night. These moments stripped away the symbols of rank, leaving only warriors who understood that weakness in one meant danger for all. Meals were taken under the open sky, the cold biting at their hands as they tore into roasted meat and coarse bread. The conversations, at first guarded, grew into exchanges of stories and customs. He learned the meaning behind their war paint, the legends of their ancestors, the songs that rose low and steady before battle. In return, he spoke of Rome's legions, its distant provinces, and the gods who ruled its fate. Language ceased to be a barrier. The cadence of a comrade's breathing in the dark, the look exchanged before a charge, these became a shared tongue. And yet, with every laugh, with every nod of respect across the campfire, the shadow of Rome loomed larger. He was still a Roman general. These men were still Rome's foes. This was the fracture line running through his mind. Loyalty to the eagle standard versus loyalty to those who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the mud. He knew that when orders came, the lines would be redrawn, and the friendships forged here would be tested under the steel of war. In the eyes of the Senate, such bonds were dangerous, seeds of compromise that could weaken Rome's resolve. But in the eyes of a soldier who had looked death in the face alongside these warriors, they were something more. Proof that even across the empire's most bitter divides, respect could be earned. That respect would soon be shattered. The call to return to Rome was coming, and with it, the end of this fragile brotherhood. The gates of Rome closed behind him with a sound that felt less like welcome and more like a warning. News of his time among the northern tribes had traveled faster than he had, carried by rumor, sharpened by suspicion. In a city that prided itself on conquest, the idea of a general living, training, and learning from the so-called savages beyond the frontier was unthinkable. In the forum, the whispers followed him. Traitor, barbarian, unfit for command. Some came from senators who had never seen battle, but understood the political value of doubt. Others came from fellow officers, men who feared that his knowledge of the enemy might one day be used against Rome itself. The Senate, steeped in paranoia, debated whether his actions had been strategic brilliance or dangerous disloyalty. In an empire where loyalty was measured in blood spilled for the eagle, the lines he had crossed were not easily erased. Rome's political elite valued victory, but only when it was won by Roman methods. His scars, earned in foreign drills and savage hunts, were not badges of honor here. They were marks of contamination. The rigid pride of the patrician class saw no merit in bending to learn from an enemy, no matter the cost in Roman lives. This hostility was not just personal, it reflected a deeper truth of Roman culture. The empire had built its power on assimilation, but only on its own terms. Romanization meant imposing language, laws, and legions, not adopting the customs of those deemed barbaric. His survival beyond the limes had defied that unwritten law. Yet he carried with him something more dangerous than foreign scars: ideas, tactics that could unmake the enemy's advantage, strategies shaped by the forests, rivers, and ambush paths where Rome's rigid formations faltered. To the Senate, such knowledge was valuable, but the man who held it was not entirely trusted to wield it. The general now stood between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Among the tribes, he had been a foreigner who had earned a place by proving his strength. In Rome, he was a citizen and commander, yet viewed with the same wary eyes as those he had once lived among. The next summons would not come from the Senate chambers, but from the frontiers. And there, he would face the ultimate test, leading Roman legions against the very warriors who had once stood at his side. The first hornblast rolled across the frontier like a summons from the gods. War had come, and there would be no refuge from its demands. The enemy was not unknown raiders or nameless tribes. It was the same warriors whose war cries he had once joined, whose oaths he had once shared in the glow of a campfire. The Senate's orders were unambiguous. The Chatti had crossed into Roman territory, and the northern legions were to drive them back with decisive force. There was no room for hesitation, no consideration for past bonds. Rome demanded victory, and the man now charged with delivering it was the one who knew this enemy better than any commander alive. On the battlefield, the contrast between the two forces was stark. Roman lines advanced in disciplined formations, shields interlocked, pila poised for the opening volley. Opposite them, the Chatti spread in loose, fluid ranks, the forest at their back, their movements alive with the same untamed precision he had once trained to master. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, punctuated by the metallic tang of weapons drawn. When the charge came, recognition flashed in the eyes that met his across the chaos, not as soldier to enemy, but as brother to brother. Every clash of steel carried the weight of shared history. Every fallen man was not just an enemy of Rome, but someone whose voice he had once heard in the cold silence of the hunt. Yet command left no room for grief. His orders cut through the noise, directing maniples into positions that exploited weaknesses only he could see. Gaps in formation, habits in movement, the split-second rhythm before a Chatti shield was raised. Each tactical success was a double-edged blade, striking down both the threat to Rome and a fragment of his own past. The victory, when it came, was absolute. The Chatti were driven back, their numbers broken, their warriors scattered into the deep woods. But for the general, the triumph rang hollow. He had fulfilled Rome's will, yet in doing so, had severed the last threads binding him to the only men outside the legions who had ever stood at his side. The Senate would see only the victory. Rome would remember only the conquest, but the man who commanded it would carry the memory of that day, not as glory, but as the moment when the border between loyalty and betrayal was erased in blood. The next lesson would not come from the enemy, but from the Senate itself, when the price of his knowledge was weighed against the politics of power. He had returned from the frontier with more than scars. He carried the enemy's playbook, and Rome would weaponize it without hesitation. Years among the northern tribes had stripped away any illusions about the nature of war. He had seen how the Chatti melted into forests, how their warriors struck from shadows and vanished before a counterblow could land. These lessons clashed with the rigid doctrines drilled into every Roman recruit. But when survival demanded results, the Senate did not argue with victory. On the battlefield, his commands no longer mirrored the straight grinding advance of traditional legion warfare. He deployed cohorts in broken, fluid formations, adapting to the terrain rather than forcing it to adapt to Rome. Patrols became hunters, striking in silence at night, cutting supply lines before the main assault. Peeler volleys were timed to break morale, not just formations. The enemy was made to feel hunted long before the first sword met flesh. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Fires were set in sight of enemy encampments, but out of reach of their warriors, a constant reminder that Roman steel was close. Scouts whispered rumors into captured prisoners before releasing them, letting fear gallop ahead of the legions. These were tactics born in the deep forests and snowbound passes of the north, now turned against their creators. Yet the moral cost was undeniable. In adopting the enemy's methods, he felt the line between Roman discipline and barbarian ruthlessness blur. Each ambush, each deception, carried the weight of those earlier days when such acts had been aimed at Rome itself. Now they served her, but the brutality was unchanged. The Senate saw only results, campaigns won with fewer losses, rebellions crushed before they could ignite. To them, this fusion of tactics was innovation, proof of Rome's ability to adapt and dominate. But for the man commanding these victories, the triumph was laced with unease. He understood what the legions were becoming, and it looked more like the enemy with every passing year. In the cold efficiency of his new art of war lay a question Rome would never ask. Had he saved the Republic with this knowledge, or had he merely given it the tools to destroy its own soul? The next campaign would test that answer, against an enemy unlike any Rome had faced before. The campaign was over. The banners rolled and stored away, the eagle standards locked in the capital's armory. Rome celebrated with parades, the streets echoing with cheers, the air thick with incense. But for the soldiers, the silence after the roar of war was deafening. They returned to a city that welcomed their victories, yet barely remembered their names. Some found their homes gone, seized by creditors while they fought in distant lands. Others carried wounds no physician could see, memories of comrades lost, of orders obeyed at the cost of their own honor. Rome had fed them glory, but glory did not feed their families. For the commander, the victory felt hollow. His name was carved into marble, but marble could not speak to the dead. He knew that history would record the battles, the triumphs, the spoils, but not the faces of the men who made them possible. And so, his legacy was not in statues or Senate decrees, but in the quiet understanding that true honor lay in remembering those who served, even when the empire itself chose to forget. Rome marched on, but their shadows marched with her, forever part of her story. Empires rise on stone, steel, and sacrifice, yet they rarely return what they take. Rome demanded loyalty unto death, but offered no guarantee that a soldier's soul would remain unscarred. Behind every marble triumphal arch lies the invisible weight of choices no man should ever be forced to make. The legions marched for glory, for the Senate, for the eagle standard. But glory often came at the cost of blood spilled on familiar soil, victories that tasted like betrayal, and survival bought with the coin of one's identity. Rome's rewards were fleeting, her demands were eternal. Even her most celebrated commanders learned that serving the Republic was as much a burden as it was an honor. 2,000 years later, the question still lingers. Did Rome give enough to those who secured her empire? Or did she leave them, as she so often did, with laurels upon their brows, but shadows in their hearts? His story is not just one man's tale, but a mirror to the broader truth, that empires often take without giving back, and warriors carry the weight of impossible choices. Do you think Rome owed more to its soldiers? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more history.